Hi, everybody. So this is the Anti-Disestablishment podcast, and I want to go ahead and share my thoughts about some of the latest developments. As you probably know, there has been a lot of things going on, but I want to first come back to this idea of why did Trump win, right? Again, a lot of theories out there, but I really think people are overcomplicating it. People are overcomplicating about why so many people, for seemingly unexplainable reasons, decided to vote for him instead of, in my opinion, a much better candidate. But the reason why I think people are overcomplicating it is because none of the reasons they've provided make sense. Kamala wasn't centrist enough. That argument doesn't seem to hold water because she was by far more centrist than Trump was. Kamala didn't, for example, fix the border. How does that make sense when there was a border deal on the table and Trump sank it in order to run on the issue? I mean, again, it doesn't make sense. Kamala had too many far left positions in the past. Well, aside from the fact that she moved to the center when she ran for president, Trump held a lot of far right positions. Everything from deport, 11 million people to, just crazy things like eliminate the income tax. Sounds maybe interesting, but these are pretty radical positions. He said everything that he could possibly say. We should go after the families of terrorists. That was during his first campaign. He ran a far right campaign for the most part. He really didn't moderate, with the exception of maybe abortion. But I think, like I said, the real reason he won is because we underestimate or overestimate the reasons people vote for candidates. He had a few things that made him a very popular choice, starting with his name. We've talked about it. Trump sounds like a winning name. For that matter, Newsom perhaps would have had a better shot. But be that as it may, Trump is also one of the most popular names in the world, arguably, right now. And it's partially because he knows branding. Everything he's ever done, he's attached his name to it. We talked about signing of the checks when he was sending out those stimulus checks, and people rolled their eyes and said, well, it's so petty, but in some ways, I think it worked. He also, I think, has a very unique ability to provide overly simplistic solutions to complicated problems. That is a classical populist characteristic. But in his case, he does it so brazenly and he does it so convincingly that you can't help but wonder if he believes it. And I do believe he believes in a lot of the things he says. And which is why I don't think necessarily that J.D. Vance or a lot of these other MAGA politicians are going to be able to take over after him. Because in many cases, you need to have a somewhat simplistic mind to buy into these simplistic positions. When he said, build a wall, he genuinely believed, to some extent at least, that would work. That alone would work. But he said he would end the war in 24 hours. As ridiculous as that sounded to anybody who's been following the conflict, even remotely, he believed he could do that because he's got, to some extent, a very childish mind. But the problem is, a lot of people who weren't following the conflict heard that, saw him say it with a straight face, and believed it as well. Clearly, it was a lie. But nonetheless, I'm not sure I would even call it a lie. It was a falsehood. He clearly hasn't ended the war in 24 hours. It's been close to 24 days now, and he won't end it, this month, possibly even next month. And it's a big question as to what terms he'll end it on. But I think a lot of people give him a lot more credit than he deserves. When he says he likes tariffs, is it because he read some type of alternative economics book and really explored the nuances of trade policy? No. It's because he thinks, we can make some money off the goods we bring in. Why not do that? And a lot of people who don't understand economics say, yes, That makes sense. And it's hard. It has always been hard to argue against that, and especially so now because of social media. He can take his message directly to the people. Back then, it would go through the media, and in some cases, the newspapers, the New York Times, for example, when they heard politicians say that, that would push back. They'd say, "What do you mean? How would that help? Look at these economists who say would do the opposite." And then now he doesn't have to bother with that anymore. He says it at his rallies. He says it at on his social media posts, and people will just take it and run with it. But you also have to give him some credit in the sense that he made his campaign appealing to a lot of people who, quite frankly, just don't follow politics or were very looped in into what's going on. And so, in some ways, he was his message appealed to the most basic, I would say, aspects of human nature. If you note how much out of his way he goes to hire good-looking people, quote unquote, attractive people, he holds that in high regard. And I think, again, a lot of people, a lot of Democrats laughed at that. And they said, well, surely people will see through that. I mean, just because somebody looks good on TV doesn't mean they're going to make a good candidate. And I think the biggest problem that Democrats made was that they overestimated the electorate. And it's not a very popular thing to say, because over and over again, we've been told that the people know best. And like I said in the last few episodes, they don't. A lot of times they don't. That's not to say that people who are in politics know better. A lot of times they have ulterior motives, and maybe they should know better. But I think we give ourselves too much credit. A lot of times, a lot of people, because they have busy lives, will just look and see, oh, you know what? That campaign looks good. And they have easy solutions to these complicated problems. And they say it very convincingly. I'll go for them. And I really think at the end of the day, that's what worked. It wasn't the first time that's worked in American politics. As we talked about, Jackson had a very similar style, not nearly to the extent of Trump's, but he still was able to go in and pretend to be the man of the people. And ultimately, in my opinion, his presidency was one of the worst. Unfortunately, for a period of time in history, he was actually thought of to be a good president. And that's what I'm a little worried might happen in the future here as well. But we'll see what happens. I also think a big part of all this, something that would not have flown in the past, is the degradation of standards in our society. I really want to ask a lot of people who voted for Trump, you have heard him lie to you. You've said, for example, that he'll end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours. Why doesn't that bother you? He hasn't. Clearly, that was wrong. And they just kind of shrug and say, well, I know what he meant. And a lot of times I think that's what the message is that, yeah, he lies to us, but we know when he lies to us. When Kamala lies to us, it's a little harder to tell. When Biden lies to us, it's a little harder to tell, but Trump, we know when he lies. So we'd prefer that. That might be true, but I think it's more than that, because one of the things that really gets to me about Trump is that he just brags nonstop about how he's the best. And I was raised in a way that's not acceptable. It's just not acceptable. You should be modest. You should show humility. But it doesn't bother people that he does that, not nearly as much as it used to. And again, I think I provided the example of President Ford. He got an attempted assassination. He goes to his meeting nonetheless. Doesn't say a word about it. Trump puts a big Band-Aid on his ear, walks around for everybody to see, even though he got released from the hospital within an hour or so, and it barely grazed him. He made a meal out of that. But it doesn't bother people that he brags, that he always plays the victim. I don't know why. And I think it's because it's more acceptable for us to do it nowadays too. In music, people are always talking about how they're this or they're that. A few generations ago, modesty and humility was much more valued. So in many ways, Trump is a reflection of that. He comes in with this braggadocious style, and a lot of people like me are like, well, why would anybody vote for him? But a lot of people kind of shrug their shoulders and say, yeah, I hear it all the time. It doesn't bother me. Fair enough. But that is a part of it. A big part of it is also that Trump, if you notice, there's really no long-term planning on his part. And he said it as much as himself. He said basically he just lives in the moment. He doesn't worry about the future. He tries to solve problems as they arise. And that's why you'll see him seemingly make some absurd decisions that are long-term, that have long-term consequences that he doesn't seem to appreciate. But nonetheless, in today's society, a lot of us do that too. We kind of live in the moment. We don't really plan ahead. And so in some ways, he's also not being as judged for that as he used to be. And last but not least, one of the polls that bothers me the most is recently, you may have seen, I've seen various types of polls that basically say that, look, if you had a dictator, would you still vote for him? And I've seen a lot of Trump supporters say that, where I think there was an interview with a guy and he was like, yeah, people say he's like Hitler. He might be, but I'm still going to vote for him. And, my reaction to that is, what? But a lot of people feel that way, especially a lot of people in the younger generation. I think there was a poll done in England that basically asked, would you want essentially a strong man in charge of your country? And like half the people said yes. And a lot of people in older generations are baffled by that response. But if you think about it, World War II was 2025. It ended in 1945. It's 80 years ago. That's a few generations ago. The memory of it has been lost. We take democracy for granted. We see the failures of democracy almost every day. The gridlock, which I would argue isn't actually all that bad. But nonetheless, a lot of young people see it. They see nothing, a lot of a very incremental and slow progress, I would call it. And they want faster change. And so they're okay with it. Of course, until they realize that there are some serious drawbacks to having a strongman president, especially if they disagree with his policies. But that's besides the point, although that's why the Generation Z's support of Trump has plummeted from the most recent reports. But nonetheless, you also have a serious lack of historical knowledge. And as World War II and other dictatorships that have really harmed the world become more and more in the rear view window, there's a real risk that people will forget and will have to relearn some of those important lessons. Let's get to a few other things that I wanted to mention. I may have mentioned this in the previous podcast, but the negotiations right now that started with Ukraine, I'm actually willing to give them a little bit of, I'm willing to give them a bit of benefit of the doubt, because I think I hear a lot of people basically saying that, look, how can you take NATO off the table? Ukraine was never going to join NATO. It can't. It's got occupied territories. Unless it cedes those territories formally to Russia, it can't realistically join NATO. So, and them saying the obvious to me doesn't bother me. They also said something like Ukraine can't take back all the occupied territories. And yeah, right now it is unrealistic. So I don't even think that's an issue. I think in some ways they're just stating the obvious. But I am worried that, again, Trump only cares about himself and he only cares about looking good. He doesn't actually even care about making a good deal or making sure that it's in the best interest of the United States. If he can get a good headline, that's all he really cares about. And we saw that with the tariffs. He implemented the tariffs, essentially got nothing back in return, and then halted them. He doesn't care. He got a good headline. He looked strong, and so then he took that and ran with it. But nonetheless, what I worry about is that if he continues these expansionist remarks about Greenland, about Panama, about Canada being the 51st state, some absurd notions of Gaza becoming an American, I don't know, tourist property where he can presumably build, Trump resorts. I don't know what the goal there is. But he might try to use that with Putin or Xi even, and basically try to make a grand bargain. Let me have Greenland. You can have Ukraine. You can have Taiwan. And so, in some ways, that's what worries me. And I'm sure that's also something that both Russia and China were considering. And I think when Putin meets with Trump, I'll be surprised if he doesn't try to feel him out to see if he's willing to make that bargain. Hopefully, there's enough people around Trump who'll knock some sense into him if he even considers that possibility. But nonetheless, it is something that is concerning. At the same time, we need to be fair. And so, this deregulation thing that's going on with Doge, let's be fair about what that is. And so, on one hand, I think they're going about it completely the wrong way. And again, it's because he just wants the headline. And I should also mention about Elon. A lot of people say he's one of the greatest engineers to have ever graced the face of this earth. He's not an engineer, he's a businessman. He's a good businessman in the sense that he can take very high risks that also, if they work out, have a high reward. He's able to be laser focused, or at least he was. I don't think he is anymore, on what he's trying to accomplish. And he, in some ways, is a visionary. He can see what the future is. He saw that with the electric cars. He saw that with the rockets. And so, in some ways, he's, I would say, aggressive businessman, but it's paid off. And he has, in many ways, improved the lives of society through his business ventures. But he's not an engineer. He doesn't know how to make those rockets land, or exactly how, for example, to increase battery consumption and any of that stuff. I have my own issues with Elon. I think in some ways he is an opportunist. Right now he's trying to bank on the populism that is MAGA. And I think he's going to overplay his cards. And I think there's going to be a rift between him and Trump, as a lot of people have said. I do think that's going to happen sooner or later. But at the same time, I also would say that, as many people believe, the government is bloated. We have a serious deficit problem, and something needs to be done, and something drastic and something aggressive. I'm not necessarily against that. I just don't like the way they've been going about it. You can't just destroy USAID. That's causing a lot of suffering to a lot of people worldwide. You can't just go in, send a bunch of teenagers or 20-year-olds to shut down parts of the government that they don't understand how it works. The government is by no means as efficient as a business. The government is probably only about 50% efficient, but that 50% that it does is very important. It's very essential. You have to be careful. You could have frozen the funding, frozen the hiring. You could have done a lot of different things. And then, carefully, with a scalpel, or maybe something more, try to cut down the spending, especially since a lot of the things they're cutting, it's not going to make a significant difference in the debt. Social Security reform, absolutely. Medicaid reform, perhaps. I'm sure there's a lot of waste in the military as well. But they're taking a hammer. And I think now, if there's any catastrophes, natural catastrophes, other types of disasters, man-made disasters, that's going to be on them. If there's any link to the cutting of different programs that they're pursuing right now. So I'm very much in favor of cutting a lot of those programs. I think they're being too reckless with it, and I think it's going to harm them. I'll end on this note, though. Speaking of the future, The Democrats worry me in some ways even more. Don't get me wrong, I was a big fan of Kamala's campaign. I thought it was a good centrist campaign. Yes, she's a typical politician in some ways. I don't believe that she really went from her more progressive positions to the center. But quite frankly, I never believed that she had those more progressive positions to start with. I think in some ways, she probably believes to some extent some of them, but she was probably looking to win the primary in 2020 and then win the presidency in 2024, so she shifted, just like any other politician would, and to some extent, Trump did. That said, what worries me is, as I mentioned, the takeaway that the Democrats will have. A lot of them are saying, well, Kamala was too far to the left, but again, she basically campaigned with Liz Cheney. She was for fracking. She was very much in favor of a lot of the things that Republicans would have traditionally been in favor of. She had a pretty strong border position. In fact, they were able to get the border under control a little too late, but nonetheless, in the last 6 months leading up to the election. I mean, she basically ran a Reagan campaign and she lost. So my worry is that the takeaway is going to be, well, no, if that didn't work, we need to run somebody like Bernie. Younger, but somebody like Bernie, like maybe an AOC. And what frightens me is there might be some truth to that. I think the only person who could have beat Trump would have probably been somebody like Bernie, because that's just populism on the left. But I don't want that. And I think the next election, all Democrats have to do is stand firm, double down on their principles. Yes, maybe obviously change some things about the way they go about delivering their message. But overall, I like their platform in 2024. I don't want them to change it. I don't want them to move to Bernie or AOC. I want them to double down on the centrist message, because I think that the Trump campaign and the Trump presidency will implode. And I'm afraid it's going to get worse before it gets better, because he's going to let the power get to his head. You have to understand that this is a 70-year-old man. He'll be, at the end of his presidency, 82. He thinks he knows best because he has beat the odds so many times. People thought he was politically dead after January 6th, as he should have been. And he should have been buried by McConnell, who, again, was, quite frankly, too weak and too cowardly, I should say, to finish him with the impeachment proceedings. But he was allowed to survive to live another day, and now here we are again. I mean, we were so close, but yet here we are. But again, he's going to overplay his hand, because if he thinks he's God's gift to the world and he only knows that he's right, and he now surrounds himself with a lot of yes people, he is going to make some truly, truly horrendous decisions. Double down on them. And I would not be surprised if his presidency ends in another impeachment, but this time one that's actually ends in a conviction, or one where, I don't know, mass protests or something else that basically forces him to leave office. I don't see him riding off gently into the night. I hope I'm wrong. I hope after he does a lot of the stuff for show and his approval rating drops, he just has these dinner balls and eats his 2 scoops of ice cream and rage watches CNN or MSNBC. And it's kind of, in some ways, to some extent, like that first term. But I'm afraid that based on the first 24 days, he's going to want to use and abuse his power. And there may be a constitutional crisis. I hope I'm wrong. But we, at the same time, can't too quickly. There are some things that he's doing that worry me. But for now, he has the authority to do most of them. And so it's up to the people to decide whether they like it or not. And I hope enough people over time will come around to the fact that this is the Mad King. And if given the opportunity, he will burn everything down. And I hope then the Democrats come in with a centrist, maybe Kamala, maybe somebody else, and they show how to run a country, which Biden, I thought, did fairly well during his 4 years. That's it. That's it for now.